Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Green Justice Project. We are four empowered women from North America who have come together to discuss development in BIPOC communities. Our next slide shows the roadmap to how our project takes you through our proposal. Take it away, background.
The context for the project is the continued fight against climate change. Traditional development has had negative consequences, and so green development tactics have been implemented to mitigate these harms. This new intersection of green and traditional development created new issues of green and climate gentrification, along with growing environmental degradation from lack of significant action on climate change. These issues greatly impact BIPOC communities who bear the brunt of climate change heavily already. And so there are numerous initiatives, programs, orgs, government actions, and so on already doing incredible work with leading cities in other areas. But we aim to have community-centered, equitable, and inclusive project. Our main objectives for the project are supporting BIPOC communities to be involved in the climate change fight and not be displaced by it. Secure funding for these communities, engage in community-centered process to create successful projects, and have a network of BIPOC communities that help progress the fight of climate change and marginalization. And so this will be reflected in the overview.
Yeah, and to just clarify for anyone who's unfamiliar, BIPOC refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So now we'll go into our project model along with our target actions and populations. The Green Justice Project is proposing a $35 million investment in 10 American cities. This project is similar to the current American Cities Climate Challenge that is funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies and spearheaded by the Natural Resources Defense Council that Bloomberg, which is you, currently fund. But instead of focusing on the largest and most climate-forward cities, this project intends to incorporate a different cohort of cities. We believe that your commitment to climate action and equity will align with this project and its goals. Here's a look through of our proposal. So we have produced a proposal document that goes through the background and context for this project, as well as other elements that we're going to highlight right now in our presentation. So while we believe that the selection of cities will be conducted by the funders, project partners, other stakeholders, and of course the communities themselves, we have identified some criteria for which cities we would like to focus on. So this criteria includes a majority of BIPOC cities. So the city population is majority Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There's a heavy industry presence in those communities, along with a limited green space and walkability, as well as little or no grants or resources currently available to define and implement green and climate actions. A small population, we've identified a range of under 100,000 people, and as well as a location where there's an intersection of both of social, environmental, and racial justice issues. So based on our evolving conversations, we are happy to adjust this criteria. A city that actually fits this criteria is my hometown of Pittsburgh, California, which is pictured here in the Bay Area. Pittsburgh is home to about 75,000 residents, majority of whom are BIPOC. The city relies heavily on cars, especially for commuting to jobs outside of the city, to San Francisco, etc. Most of the city's local economy is dependent on heavy industry, such as steel plants, energy storage facilities, which are seen here, as well as chemical plants. As of now, the city does not have a climate action plan, but it does anticipate significant sea level rise along the waterfront. The city is home to a number of environmental and social justice issues as well, such as proximity to toxins and heavy policing. We hope that our project efforts can help solve for such intersectional issues and help cities like Pittsburgh begin to strive toward a just and equitable future. So in order to begin making a just transition, we have identified a few key pathways. These are education, economic development, infrastructure, and ecosystems and conservation. Within each of these within each of these pathways, we have identified a number of green actions that cities can take. These are not set in stone, but are examples of what these cities can begin working on. With stakeholder engagement, they are subject to evolve. So now we're going to dive deeper into some of these green actions.
We first wanted to take a look at education. We wanted to focus on our youth by creating school workshops in a school gardening environment. This is just a template, and we know that it'll grow according to the class, the students, and the teachers. In addition, we also wanted to focus on career and technical education. It is necessary to include career and technical education pathways for young adults and industry professionals who wish to transition into the green job sector. We also know that it might be complicating getting to know all the current and up-to-date information on sustainable development. So we've created a one-stop green shop, which will be located at community centers, businesses, libraries, information that communities can gather, people who are interested on how to change their lifestyles and make it more sustainable. We now are going to talk about the next action, the green action.
Yeah, so the next action is economic development. And within economic development, we've identified two different actions. The first of which is green rules, which sets forth 10 rules that small businesses must follow to receive loan repayment reductions. So if they receive a loan from the city and they follow a set number of these rules, then the amount that they have to repay will be lessened. Some of these rules includes green spaces, composting, locally sourced food, and more. The second action is land stewardship employment. In many areas experiencing green gentrification, the land and public spaces are stewarded by volunteers. Volunteering is difficult for some BIPOC community members who cannot afford to spend their time volunteering and must work towards their wages. If these roles were, however, paid and catered to BIPOC or formerly incarcerated individuals, like Planting Justice pictured here in Oakland, then they will lead to employment, land stewardship, healing, and also prevent green gentrification because the land is tended to by the communities that rely on it and live near it. Now we're going to take a look at infrastructure.
The infrastructure action pathway is a big focus of the climate justice project, since two of the main carbon contributors affecting climate change within city settings are buildings and transportation. So first and foremost, we would want to kind of see what each city has already. And by doing this, we do an infrastructure assessment just to kind of get a gauge of what each city has, what we're working with, and kind of where efforts can be targeted to be like the most impact. For buildings, we kind of set forth some green actions in regards to benchmarking. We want to know how much emissions are being emitted, I guess, from each building. And then we'd move forward with some energy efficiency retrofits in regards to HVAC systems, lighting, water efficiency, all that kind of good stuff. And then one of the moonshot goals would be to have buildings in the future developed as net zero buildings, so no emissions. And then onto transportation, we want to plan for future infrastructure. So by getting an improved biking and pedestrian network within the plan, it kind of helps itself to develop over time. Additionally, we would want to implement a bike or scooter share and a bike subsidy action just to kind of promote active transportation to reduce the use of vehicles. And we do realize that vehicles are a bit of a necessity in these types of cities. So we'd want to kind of promote adoption to electrics by installing EV charging stations in community spaces identified by those who would use them as beneficial. And now we'll talk about some ecosystem and conservation actions.
The ecosystems and conservation pathway uses traditional and expanded definitions of ecosystems, human and non-human, which can include urban areas. The trust will be used to retain community ownership and sovereignty and mitigate any green gentrification while also protecting critical ecosystem areas like agricultural land. The biodiversity initiatives will promote conservation and coexistence in communities in regards to animal and vegetation diversity and connected to the well-being of the individuals in these communities. The goal will also be to maintain relationships of protected and critical lands with BIPOC communities, especially if they've already had long-standing relationships with these lands historically. The education and resources reflected in this pathway reflect that all the pathways and all of our green actions are connected, and we will hope to create many overlapping solutions for our communities and help mitigate climate change and marginalization. We'll now show how we're going to implement these actions in our project.
So it's been said you can't manage what you can't measure. So we want to have some concrete numbers to gauge project success. And to do this, we would need a baseline in each city that's chosen. Some of the metrics that we've identified here are based on the green actions we've also outlined. But as mentioned before, we really want community engagement to be key. So if a community prioritizes some actions above others, all these metrics won't be used. But some of them include enrollment numbers in schools and green programming, the total dollar value of the green business loans we hand out, emissions levels, percent renewable energy sources, the number of sustainable retrofit projects, and the ridership and use of public and active transportation. And additionally, the total percent of land within the city dedicated to green space. Now we'll discuss some partnerships.
We want to talk about how foundations, donors, communities, governments, and other organizations play a vital role in our proposal. The communities will help advocate, and we will also petition for support and carry out their civic duty to their community. In addition, governments will help with implementation, outreach, and any additional funding. With foundations and donors, we have a specific ask for you.
So what we are asking from you is $35 million to fund the Green Justice Project. We plan on distributing the money evenly between the 10 chosen cities so that each city will be given $3.5 million over the course of the 3-year program. In the next slide, we just have a sample budget kind of broken down between the green pathways that we identified and then further into the green actions. But as mentioned before, this is really just a framework because we want to really emphasize the community priority that's identified during the engagement process of the project. And now we'll discuss
Our outcomes with our project model, we hope to have positive and progressive outcomes for our BIPOC communities and progress to addressing climate change. Overall, you'll see communities are the pillar of this project. Our next slide will show that.
Yeah, so as Debbie highlighted, communities are at the center of this project. This project cannot happen without community buy-in, and therefore they must be included in every step of the way. We have not identified the cities yet because the cities themselves need to be willing to work on this project. We cannot impose this work onto them. We would like to eventually leave them with ownership over these actions and new ones, and truly follow this incredible spectrum of community engagement to ownership that was co-created by Rosa Gonzalez from Facilitating Power. And so you can look through this on your own time, but essentially the goal is to work the way up towards community ownership rather than just pushing actions onto cities or marginalizing their voices and not even including them in the process. And so we want to shift away from that towards ownership. We're going to go ahead and take a look at some of our next steps now.
So now, are you willing to sign our memorandum of understanding? Are you willing to commit to the Green Justice team's proposal? Are you willing to commit to providing all the necessary steps to provide BIPOC communities equal opportunities and committing to upholding and incorporating the UN Sustainable Development Goals in your projects? You know you want to sign. Thank you all.
Thank you. Just in time. Within the given time, wonderful presentation, very exciting. A lot of claps there going on, and I'm sure you also have your comments and questions to the Green Justice team. Let's open the floor if you have any comments and questions to Green Justice. While You must be thinking about what to ask. Let me just help here to bridge the gap so that others will also join. Others can also join in later on. Well, thank you, group, for that. Very excellent. Sort of a very ambitious plan, as well. Let me ask you a couple of questions. What would be the immediate challenges do you think you'd be facing? What are the risks that you foresee when going into this venture, and how do you plan to address that?
For me, the immediate challenge that I see is not getting community support, and that's what we're trying to advocate. As I first mentioned, we're just 4 empowered women that care about these issues. But at the end of the day, we won't be able to implement this if we don't have the local support. So we don't want to just come in and be like, our idea is the best, you need to implement it, which is why we suggested petitioning, partnering up with local nonprofits, community leaders, identifying those people and proposing these ideas to them and seeing if they have any suggestions and how we can adapt our proposal to their needs as well for when we ask for this funding.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
wanted to add
yes.
one thing to that. Yeah, Debbie, completely on point with that. And I think like looking at it from like a funding perspective, because I actually work for the American Cities Climate Challenge as an independent consultant. And the thing with the challenge is that the funders are looking for, like funders like Bloomberg Philanthropies are looking for cities that are going to be spearheading these actions. So they're looking for like leaders that they know will achieve success, and especially in large cities, because for them, they have certain metrics to meet and certain measures to show that their funding is actually going towards a good cause. And so I think the challenges here are to convince them as well that this is a worthwhile project, because we are going for small cities, cities that people maybe don't know about, cities where these problems are much harder because they're so intrinsically tied to other justice issues. And so convincing them to kind of go like back up a project like that, which is so nuanced, I think can be a challenge looking at like the funding aspect of it.
Okay, yes, thank you. Any other thoughts, people? Carly, you wanted to say something? Yes,
I just have a quick question. For your guys's, I think you called it a one-stop green shop, if I remember correctly. Is that more of a like physical building, or were you thinking more of it's like an like a, I guess like an online platform, or what were you guys kind of thinking for that? Although I think kudos for the idea. That's a great idea and definitely something people need.
So for that one, we kind of wanted to implement that within community spaces that are already like there. So like libraries, community centers, we can kind of just have an area with all the information so that people don't have to sift through the multitude of information. It can kind of just like rebate programs, green living, like behavioral changes, all that kind of good stuff could be accessible and in a building that's already accessible to the community.
Cool, great, thank you. And fabulous job, you guys. I loved your little flip book. That was great.
Thank you.
I have a little question, might be, I don't know. How would COVID impact this idea and plan in the aftermath of everything that has happened?
Yeah, I can share my thoughts on that. I think that like in a way, COVID and everything that's happened since, especially in the States, has brought to light just the inherent and systemic challenges that many institutions and philanthropies and NGOs and governments face. And I think that these conversations, like being in a space like this, they're having these conversations a lot more. I think they're realizing that they can't just not take action. So I feel like in a way, COVID would actually help promote this kind of program if we frame it in a way that like caters to like revitalization of communities, resilience, economic development. I think those are things that are really important for a lot of people right now, and how do we also like incorporate social and racial justice and not like perpetuate more harm, I think is at the forefront of a lot of thinking amongst our like leaders in these spaces. And so I think that they would be more inclined to support a project like this.
And to follow
I could,
Manisha's general description, which is kind of like where everyone in the U.S. agrees where we are at that point. And it also, in a way, COVID gives us an optimal environment in the sense that these things would actually get done. An example of that would be since certain cities are seeing an exodus, especially with gentrification, whether climate or traditional gentrification have already been recurring, as well as with other racial issues that are currently going on and other movements are currently going on in the US. It's given everybody a reset opportunity to try and see if we can start implementing projects right away to kind of like reverse some of the harm that's already been done, as well as make progress moving forward.
yeah, and I just want to mirror what both Korbin and Manisha just said. Can talk a little bit more about numbers in New York State. COVID affected 34% of the Hispanic population and 29% of the Black population. And so with those numbers, we're seeing a disproportionate effect of COVID in these communities. And if we focus on revitalizing these communities, having safer access to healthcare and economic development funds, so on and so forth, can address any other type of outbreak in the future as well.
Anything else from anybody else? Okay, let me again then join in. It's a fascinating idea that you want to sort of look at these cities and see how these green initiatives that you bring about will impact. You had a very nice. What I liked about your presentation was also the fact that you had a clear pathway of the input and then what sort of outputs and outcomes you expect out of that. But what about if I were to ask you, what's your scaling strategy? I mean, how would you once you start in a certain city, I think you said you don't want to start with Pittsburgh, right? How would you then scale it up? What's your plan for that? Have you thought about how would you convey your message to the other cities?
Yeah, I think so I gave an example of Pittsburgh as a city that fits the criteria, but isn't necessarily one of the 10 cities. And so I think we tried to keep that open because in the end it has to, or at least with the American Cities Climate Challenge, they did an application process. So it was kind of like this competition where cities were trying to get selected to be a part of this program. And so I think the decision of how to select the cities in the end will be dependent on the existing partners. So like our team, the funders, as well as like other like important key players in this implementation process can help with thinking through, well, okay, now how do we reach the cities? But I think the like key part of it is that communities and cities have to be interested in doing this work themselves and like not have been doing this work prior to this challenge or this action. And so I think like it would be modeled very similarly to existing programs in that once the cities are selected, they are, there's a network that's built in where they're working with community groups, local government, like local like NGOs and nonprofits in the area who are then also working with the philanthropy. So it's like this huge network. And I think that it's hard to like figure out that network when the key players are still getting placed into it. But I would imagine that all 10 cities would start at the same time, like it would be a cohort of cities who will continue to learn and grow from one another. Did anyone have any other thoughts on that?
In terms of scale, in a sense, in a mega meta sense, as Manisha has said, you know, our proposal is set up right now is just funding for 10 cities. And through whether application process and then also these cities have to be interested and these communities have to be interested to do this work. And so it's gonna, you know, sift through the 10 pilot cities, and given hopefully, you know, with the funding and the success, you would have these 10 cities, you know, have great successful actions, projects that would reflect the actual need, because there's not too many community-centered programs out there, especially in a philanthropic sense. And so our hope would be that when these 10 cities have sustained success and sustained communities, that it would lead to maybe scaling it up to include more cities in the future, and possibly even more areas that might be neglected from major initiatives throughout the country.
This might be a little bit idealistic, Debbie speaking as well, but in a perfect world, we would travel to these 10 cities as well. And that's why one of our key partners is the local government, because they would help in the implementation. And we can, you know, and this is for everybody in the States and anyone in a democratic country, but you can request to meet with your elected officials. And so you can request to meet with your city council member, your town council member, your assembly person, your state senators, so on and so forth. Getting in a room with them, even if you're meeting with somebody on staff, they're sort of obligated to nudge you in the right path. And so connecting you with other local organizations that are already working on similar ideas. At the end of the day, we're not our own nonprofit that's coming in making this big ask. We have to partner up with others, because that's what makes the project and the proposal sustainable as well.
Okay. Did you introduce the team, by the way? What's the strength of the team? The team, this wonderful team that made this presentation.
Oh, I said it in the beginning, sorry, because we had I was muted and then I had to restart it. Yeah. And I said we were 4 young empowered women, but our project is Korbin from Chicago, Illinois, who has a degree in environmental studies from Bates College. Manisha from Pittsburgh, California, currently working as an independent consultant for the American Cities Climate Challenge, and she just finished her master's in environmental justice and governance from Stanford. We also have Kristyn from Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada, in a degree in environmental engineering from the University of Manitoba. And then me, Debbie, I have a BA in international relations, minor in Latin American studies, and I currently work for a state senator in New York State.
Great. See, that really adds value to whatever you said you're going to do. No, so yeah. Sorry, I missed that part at the beginning, but
no, yeah, that was me being muted. I'm sorry.
That's really useful, and that's so important that we want to know who is coming up with this proposal, and that adds value to your social networking and other sorts of networking that will be so essential for any project to implement and be successfully implemented. Great. Any other questions, comments from the rest of the audience?
Hey everyone, it's Melissa. Awesome presentation, and I love the addition of the proposal, so thanks for going above and beyond for this course. I'm curious, because while you were introducing yourselves, and I know we have a really global cohort as well, and maybe this is a question for everybody in the class, but hearing their plan and adding to Sagar's question, do you think that this is a framework that could be used in other countries as well outside of the US? And if not, or if so, or if not, what would need to be different?
So I've dabbled a bit in international development work, and I've primarily worked on education and sustainability, like eco-friendly, sustainable projects. This framework, in all honesty, if we're focusing on education, economic development, infrastructure, and ecosystems and conservation, can be applied almost anywhere. But once again, that's why our proposal is flexible, it's adaptable. It's not absolute truth. And I think that that's important to acknowledge when proposing anything is we need to be sure that, we have great ideas, but it's not absolute truth and that we're enforcing it upon people. We need to be open and flexible to different interpretations. We need to be open to a local reality. And once again, that's what makes it sustainable. It's when you incorporate more ideas and more of the local issues and local partners that make projects more sustainable in the sense that they're able to carry themselves out and sort of fulfill that circle. And so there's like that, and also funding is going to look different in other parts of the world. That's $35 million in 10 cities. $35 million somewhere else might cover more cities or maybe less. Infrastructure is still something that the developing world is still struggling with a lot. And so if we can find a way to incorporate green infrastructure in developing countries, it might save them the pollution issues that the states and other developed countries are attributing to as well.
And to follow what Debbie has said about the flexibility of our proposal, if anything, in terms of what we're directly posing in the US context, the green actions themselves might change, and there might be some additional pathways in a sense, just depending on kind of like what's already in place in communities that might be wanting to implement this type of model in different countries and different governmental structures. So say, for instance, if a community already has a lot of the ecosystem of conservation down packed, so there might be some other things to consider in regards to other actions to take in order to strengthen that pathway versus some of the actions in that pathway already having already an assumption in the US that a lot of communities are not in sync, or there might be some hindrance to governmental structures that help maintain have communities help maintain with other with their surrounding environment. And so I think in a more practical and a more exemplified sense, those might be some of the things that change besides what Debbie already mentioned in terms of like different funding capabilities.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think like examples are really helpful for me. And I think like one thing that I was thinking about when we were going through this project was, so like for context, in Oakland, California, there's been huge revitalization efforts of like lakes and green spaces. And as a result, places that were like completely avoided and people were like, I am not going there. And have turned into these like super pretty parks and such, and like high-rise condos, and like slowly but surely the community is being displaced. And so we're seeing a lot of green gentrification happening, and a lot of policing that is being done by some of these new residents who are now policing the traditional users who were using these spaces and kind of pushing them out. And so in a similar way, but it kind of a parallel is an example that I heard from a professor who was working in India, where there are a lot of folks who rely on picking up trash from the streets and then taking them to scrap yards and getting some sort of like baseline income from like recycling products and such. And so with the wave of like globalization and like this recycling culture in like the middle classes, in India, there was this huge like push from like these middle class people to like recycle, and then they were like looking down on like street pickers who were doing the exact same thing, but were doing it to sustain their livelihoods. And so there was this like weird like way of thinking. But then once the street pickers were kind of like formalized in a way, like they were given name tags and they were part of like a formal network, and they were like, you know, like it was legitimized by the local governance, suddenly these middle class people are like, wow, like I know a street picker, they're my friend. And like it's just like this legitimization process that has shifted the way that these communities look at each other. Like the street pickers are still doing the same thing they were doing before, but now rather than being looked down upon, they're being seen as like companions and as like people who are doing incredible work. And so the same idea is what I was trying to get at with the land stewardship roles in cities in the US, where if, you know, formerly incarcerated people were like looked down upon by society and like excluded from opportunities, but if they were legitimized through these roles, these paid roles where they're able to tend to the land, not only does that benefit their mental health and well-being, but it provides them with a paid source of income, and in a way destigmatizes who they are. And so like even though these are completely different contexts, completely different situations, completely different continents, I feel like the issues are still very much similar and context specific, but a program like this can apply to address both of them, as long as they're adapted and inclusive of the communities there. So that's just like a quick example to shed light on that.
Thank you. That was a lot of good insight as well. Does anybody else have insight from maybe, you know, hearing this project and seeing if that could apply back home? I know, like Kristyn, is that something that, you know, obviously you believe in it because it's something that you've been working on for your capstone project, but is that something you can be seeing in Canada, you know, or any other areas?
Yeah, definitely. I think like in Canada, this thing could work. There's definitely communities that are high industry, majority BIPOC, left out of the green conversation. And I think for sure they can be identified and could implement this as is right now, just because of the similarities in culture. But just to mirror what all my teammates said, I think we have the kind of foundations in place, and to implement it in different countries would kind of be just a real, like you'd kind of have to know the local culture, local knowledge, and use local context to kind of make it work. But yeah, definitely could be used in Canada.
Wonderful. If someone can answer this quickly, because I don't want to take up everybody's time again, or if there are more questions, but I am curious how you decided on Bloomberg Philanthropies. Like, what about them did you think that this was like the key player to ask for funding from?
So we didn't identify the others, but it's Bloomberg, Rockefeller Brothers, and Kresge, because they're the ones who are currently funding the American Cities Climate Challenge in the US, or the USDN, which is the Sustainability Directors Network, which are two of the leading groups that are doing this kind of work with cities and frontline communities. And so as funders, they're already committed to these actions. We wouldn't have to convince them. It was just more about reallocating those resources towards a new sector of the community, or a new sector of cities.
Awesome, thank you.